In a town where a man's life was worth less than the dust on a boot, one voice dared to speak for the price of a soul. The crowd saw only a beast, a savage to be broken and sold under the blistering Sunday. They clamored for the sting of the whip, their faces twisted with hate. But she saw something else entirely, a flicker of humanity worth more than all the gold in the territory. As the auctioneer's hand rose, her words cut through the jeering mob, a shocking promise that would change everything. Don't hurt him. I'll buy him. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The sun beat down on the dusty streets of Red Rock, baking the cruelty right into the air as the words left her lips and hung in the sudden, shocked silence. A quiet so profound it felt louder than the previous jeers. On a makeshift platform stood a man, bound in chains, his spirit a solitary flame refusing to be extinguished by the bruises that marred his proud face. The crowd had jeered just moments before, their voices a venomous chorus. "Look at the savage," one man had spat, his voice thick with casual hate. The auctioneer had raised his whip, a wicked grin on his face, a showman relishing his power over life and death. But before the leather could crack, a sharp voice cut through the noise. Her voice. "Don't hurt him." All heads had turned then, and a path had formed in the mob as if by an invisible force. A path that now led from the shadows where she always stood to the brutal stage at the center of town. It was Alara, a woman they knew only as a quiet face, the town's meek schoolteacher. She pushed forward now, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs as she passed faces. She recognized the blacksmith's wife, whose children she taught, now staring with cold contempt. Every eye was a nail pinning her in place, yet she moved, driven by a conviction that felt both foreign and absolute. "I'll buy him," she had warned, the words a promise sealed in the suffocating heat. "Call him savage all you want. I see a man worth saving." The auctioneer, a fleshy man with sweat, stains darkening his shirt, stared at her, his grin replaced by a sneer of disbelief. But greed was a language he understood better than hate. Alara reached into her modest dress and pulled out a small, heavy pouch of coins, the fabric worn thin from years of anxious counting. It was everything. Every penny saved from mending clothes and teaching letters, the sum of a life lived on the margins, a dream of a different future now dissolving into the dust. She poured the coins onto the auctioneer's grimy scale, the clatter of silver and copper the only sound in the dead air. It was a cold, brutal transaction, not a negotiation but a surrender. He gave her a piece of paper, a bill of sale, the ink still wet, and with it, ownership of a human soul. Her hand trembled as she took the flimsy document, its weight feeling heavier than iron. She walked to the platform, her steps deliberate, her gaze fixed on the man. He watched her approach, his dark eyes holding no gratitude, only a deep, guarded stillness that seemed to absorb the world's hatred without reflecting it. He was a stone in the river of their contempt. Wordlessly, she held up the paper, then turned to lead him away, the iron chain connecting his wrists clinking softly with each step. The silence of the crowd finally broke, not with a roar, but with a hiss of whispers. A tide of venom that followed them. Traitor. Fool. Indian lover. The words were stones thrown at her back, each one finding its mark. She did not look at their faces, the twisted masks of her neighbors, but she felt their hatred like a physical force, a wall she had to push through to reach the edge of town, to breathe air that wasn't thick with judgment. Beside her, the man named Kai walked in his chains, his silence, a mystery as profound and unsettling as the desert itself, a silent partner in her sudden, catastrophic exile. The door of the small, isolated home closed with a soft click, a sound that seemed to sever the last thread connecting them to the hostile world outside, leaving Alara's heart hammering against the sudden, shocking finality of her choice. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was not peaceful, it was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and the weight of what had just happened, a presence more suffocating than the jeering mob. This was Alara's sanctuary, a place of worn wooden floors, the faint scent of dried herbs, and neatly stacked books. Her small, ordered world now thrown into chaos by the chained man who stood at its center. He was a figure carved from stone and shadow, the iron on his wrists a brutal contradiction to the gentle domesticity of the space, making her home feel impossibly fragile. There was no master here, and no slave, only a chasm of fear and distrust that felt as wide as the plains. Alara moved with a quiet purpose that belied the tremor in her hands. Her actions a deliberate ritual to ward off the paralysis of fear. She retrieved a small rusted key from a drawer and placed it not in his hand, but on the edge of the small wooden table beside him, the metal making a faint sound against the wood. It was an offering, not a command. A question. He watched her, his eyes unreadable, but made no move toward it. The key sat between them, a silent testament to a freedom he was not yet willing to accept from her hand, a symbol of a trust that had to be earned, not given. The test had begun. She turned away, fetching a basin of warm water and clean rags, the simple task grounding her. Tending to his wounds was a crossing of another, more intimate boundary. She approached him slowly, cautiously, as one might approach a wounded wolf that could lash out at any moment. He remained unnervingly rigid as she gently dabbed at the blood crusted on his face and the raw, chafed skin at his wrists, his muscles coiled tight beneath her touch. She saw the full extent of the town's cruelty up close, a split lip, a deep bruise darkening his jaw. Every cleaned cut, every soothing application of salve, was a word she could not speak, an argument against the town's verdict of savage. His silence was a wall, solid and high. Her patient, methodical care was the chisel, striking again and again, hoping for a single crack. Hours bled into one another in this silent stalemate. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the room in hues of orange and deep purple as long shadows stretched across the floorboards. The smell of a simple root stew she had simmering over the hearth began to fill the cabin, a scent of warmth and life at war with the cold tension. She filled a bowl and placed it on the floor, a respectful distance from where he stood. He did not acknowledge it. He did not move. Defeated, she ate her own small portion and retreated to a chair, the chasm between them seeming wider than ever. It was only later, in the deep dark, when she was feigning sleep under a thin blanket, that she heard the soft scrape of the bowl against the wood floor, followed by the quiet, rhythmic sound of a spoon. She held her breath, listening. It was the barest of concessions, a single stone dislodged from the wall, but in the deafening silence of the house, it sounded like a landslide. The wrath of Red Rock did not wait for the sun to set. It arrived with the morning light, as cold and sharp as a winter wind. The first blow was the silence. Alara stood at the door of her small schoolhouse, the bell in her hand, but no children came running down the dusty road. One by one, their parents had made their choice. The laughter that usually filled her days was replaced by an oppressive emptiness that echoed the new void in her life. The room smelled of chalk dust and old paper, haunted by the ghosts of lessons she would no longer teach. The small, empty chairs seemed to accuse her. This was the town's first weapon, erasing her purpose. The second came when she walked to the general store, her basket empty, her stomach tight with a growing dread. Faces that had smiled at her yesterday now turned away. Conversations fell silent as she passed, and former friends suddenly found great interest in the dirt at their feet. A mother physically pulled her child to the other side of the street as if Alara's very presence were a contagion. Mr. Henderson, the store owner who had always saved her the best apples, stood at his door and simply shook his head, his eyes full of a miserable, cowardly pity before he bolted it shut. The rejection was absolute, a public branding. She was no longer a neighbor. She was a disease. That night, a rock shattered her window. The explosion of glass, a jagged messenger of the hatred that was festering in the dark. It was then that Sheriff Miller arrived, his heavy frame silhouetted in her doorway, his hat held in his hands as if he were paying a condolence call. He was a man caught between his badge and his fear, his face etched with a weary resignation. He didn't look directly at Kai, who stood like a statue in the shadows of the room, but his words were all for him. He spoke of public safety, of the whispers turning to threats at the saloon, of the town's growing fear of a beast that couldn't be tamed. He called Kai a dangerous animal she was harboring, his voice low and devoid of malice, which made the warning even more chilling. "I can't stop a fire once it's lit, Alara," he'd said, his gaze finally flicking to the broken window. He told her plainly that he could not protect her, that what the town decided to do next would be beyond his control, a threat dressed as a lament. After he left, the silence he left behind was heavier than before. Alara stood in the ruins of her life, the empty schoolhouse a monument to her choice, the bolted store a promise of starvation, the sheriff's words a prophecy of violence to come. She looked at her hands, the hands that had taught children to write their names, now deemed unclean. Through the broken window, she saw the dark, watching eyes of the town, and for the first time, a sliver of terrifying doubt entered her heart. She had acted to stop a moment of cruelty, but had she simply invited a slower, more deliberate kind of destruction upon them both? Was saving one man, a silent stranger, worth the price of her entire world? The days that followed bled into one another, each marked by the same heavy silence and the unspoken tension that filled every corner of the small cabin. A fragile routine formed between them, a life lived in the spaces between words, governed by unspoken rules of distance and respect. Alara would manage her dwindling supplies, read by the hearth, and mend her clothes, while Kai remained a watchful, still presence, his silence a constant reminder of the world she had defied. She learned the rhythm of his stillness, the way he observed everything without judgment, his quietude, a landscape she was slowly learning to navigate. The town outside their door remained a palpable threat, a beast waiting in the dark. But inside, the fear had softened into a kind of wary truce. One evening, with a cold wind rattling the window frame and the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, the truce was broken. Alara was lost in a book, the words on the page a temporary escape from the prison her life had become, when a voice, rough and quiet from disuse, cut through the crackle of the flames. "My name is Kai." Alara looked up, her heart stopping. He was looking directly at her, his eyes clear and focused in the firelight, no longer guarded but open. He spoke again, his words spare and chosen with care, each one landing with the weight of a stone. He told her of the land he knew, of tracking game through canyons the sun never touched, of reading the earth like a language she could never comprehend. He spoke of a man, a land baron named Silas Blackwood, a man with a serpent's tongue who promised gold for a safe passage through Ute territory. The words painted a vivid picture in her mind, a deal made under a wide-open sky, a handshake sealing a promise that was already a lie. He found his gold, Kai said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity. But the passage was harder than he liked. He needed someone to blame. The crude caricature of the savage that Red Rock had eagerly consumed was revealed for what it was, a convenient lie, a fiction crafted by a guilty man to cover his own failures and theft. As Alara listened, the man before her transformed. The bruises and chains, the labels and the fear, they all dissolved, replaced by the image of a skilled scout, a man of honor who had been profoundly betrayed. The silence that followed his story was different, cleansed of fear and suspicion. It was a space of shared understanding. Then, Kai moved toward the table where the rusted key had lain untouched for days. He picked it up, his movements deliberate. The sound of the metal turning in the lock was deafeningly loud in the quiet room. With a final, heavy clank, the chains fell from his wrists to the wooden floor, landing in a heap of dead iron. He rubbed the raw, red skin on his wrists, not looking at her, but at the fire. The sound was a punctuation mark on his story, an end to one chapter and the beginning of another. He was free, not because she had bought him, but because he had chosen, finally, to trust. In the quiet that followed Kai's story, a new stillness settled in the cabin, one born not of tension but of a shared fragility. Later that night, as Kai slept and the fire burned down to glowing embers, Alara watched the shadows play across the rough-hewn walls, and the past came for her. It rose not as a flood, but as a slow, inevitable tide, triggered by the sight of an honorable man brought low by lies. Her memory drifted back to a different town, a different life, to the scent of freshly cut pine and the feel of her father's calloused hand holding hers. He was a good man, a carpenter with a quiet laugh and eyes that saw the best in people, even when they didn't deserve it. He taught her how to read the grain in wood, how to find constellations in the night sky, how to believe in the simple, sturdy goodness of the world. That belief was the first thing the mob took from them. The accusation came like a fever, starting as a whisper of thief before it grew into a roar that consumed their lives. Someone's savings had vanished, and the town, hungry for a villain, chose her father. There was no trial, no evidence, only the conviction of a crowd that had turned on one of its own with the mindless ferocity of wolves. She remembered standing behind a curtain, a small, terrified girl watching familiar faces, men her father had shared drinks with, women who had praised her needlework, transform into a single, monstrous face of accusation. They didn't see a carpenter or a father. They saw a scapegoat. They saw a savage of a different kind. They were driven out with nothing but the clothes on their backs, cast into the wilderness under a sky that had suddenly lost all its familiar stars. The wilderness was less cruel than the town had been, but it was unforgiving. Her father, broken not by the hardship but by the injustice, faded like a campfire in the rain. He died with the name of his accusers on his lips, not as a curse, but as a question he could never answer. The memory receded, leaving her back in the dim light of her cabin, the cold of that loss a phantom ache in her bones. She looked at Kai, sleeping peacefully for the first time since she'd met him, and she finally understood the force that had pushed her out of the shadows in the town square. It wasn't just charity or pity. When she saw Kai on that platform, surrounded by the jeering faces, she saw her father's ghost. She heard the same lies, felt the same tide of blind hatred. Her defiance was an echo through time, a desperate attempt to rewrite the ending of a story she had already survived once. She wasn't just saving him, she was saving the memory of her father from the dust. News in the West travels on the wind, and the story of the schoolteacher who bought a savage was a gale that eventually reached the ears of Silas Blackwood. In his sprawling ranch house, a fortress of dark wood and polished leather, he was studying a map of the territory he intended to own when the report came. He received the information not with explosive anger, but with the cold, quiet irritation of a king discovering a pawn out of place on his board. He traced a line on the map with his finger, a line that ran directly through Alara's homestead, and saw not a home, but an inconvenience. Kai was more than just a betrayed scout. He was a loose end, a living witness to the crimes and broken treaties that had paved the way for Blackwood's wealth. A man like Blackwood did not suffer loose ends to exist. He did not dispatch the sheriff or the law. He dispatched a more personal kind of message. Two of his ranch hands appeared at Alara's homestead days later, their horses trampling her small garden, their presence a violation of the fragile peace she and Kai had forged. They didn't draw their guns. They didn't have to. They lounged in their saddles with a predatory ease, their smirks as ugly as the dust on their boots. Be a shame if a fire were to start, all the way out here, one of them mused, his words circling Alara like vultures. So dry and lonely. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she stood her ground, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Kai watched from the doorway, his body taut with a stillness that was far more dangerous than any outburst. His dark eyes narrowed to slits, promising a swift and brutal violence he held back only by a thread of will. The men eventually left, laughing, but the air they left behind was poisoned with fear. When intimidation failed to produce its desired result, Blackwood's tactics grew more insidious. His shadow fell upon the land itself. The creek that ran behind Alara's cabin, their only source of water for drinking, for washing, for life, began to shrink. At first, Alara hoped it was a fluke, but the next morning the gentle flow had slowed to a muddy trickle, the lifeblood of their small sanctuary choked off at its source. Kai knew at once what it meant, a dam, built upstream on Blackwood's orders. It was a declaration of war without a single shot fired, a siege of thirst and slow desperation. The pressure, which had been a distant threat, now became a constant, physical torment. The bucket came up with more mud than water. The tin cups were never full, and the specter of dehydration haunted the hot, dry days, bringing with it a dull, persistent headache and a parched throat that never felt sated. The green shoots in her garden withered and died, turning to brown dust. Blackwood was not simply trying to scare her. He was methodically turning her own land against her, twisting her sanctuary into a tomb. He was choking her out, confident that she would eventually have to give up the man he considered his property, or die alongside him. The thirst came first, a constant, rasping reminder of their slow strangulation, a physical manifestation of Blackwood's tightening grip. But where Alara saw the end of their lifeline, Kai saw only a problem to be solved. His passivity, the quiet endurance of a survivor, finally fractured under the direct assault from Blackwood. One morning, without a word, he took their last 2 empty buckets and started walking north, his stride full of a purpose she hadn't seen before. She followed, her trust in him now the only resource she had left, her own hope dwindling with every cracking step on the parched earth. He moved through the arid landscape not like a man wandering, but like one reading a map written in the language of cracked earth and hardy scrub. He was a reluctant hero, driven not by a desire for glory, but by the fundamental instinct to protect the person who had refused to let him die. After an hour under the oppressive sun, he stopped, pointing to a dark patch of rock at the base of a small mesa, a place where a sliver of shade offered the barest relief. There, hidden beneath a cluster of stubborn weeds, was a seep, a slow, steady drip of clear, clean water, a miracle of the desert. Their survival was assured for another day, but Kai knew it was not enough. Returning to the cabin, a new energy took hold of them. Their actions began to speak the volumes their voices did not. He began fortifying their small homestead, and she became his apprentice. Her hands, once accustomed to books and chalk, now learning the feel of the hammer and saw. They worked from sunup to sundown, their minimal dialogue consisting of single words: hammer, wood, here, a shorthand of shared intent. He showed her how to brace the door with an ironwood beam, how to board up the window, leaving only small slits to see and shoot through. They were no longer merely living in the cabin. They were turning it into a fortress, and with each nail driven home, Alara felt her fear being hammered into a harder, sharper resolve. The most profound shift came the day he brought out her late father's rifle. It was heavy in her hands, a cold, alien thing that smelled of oil and disuse, a tool of violence she had always despised. He didn't just teach her to aim, he taught her to understand its terrible purpose. His instruction was patient, his hands guiding hers, showing her how to feel its balance, how to control her breathing, how to make the weapon an extension of her will. When she finally fired it, the explosion of sound was a violent baptism, a deafening roar that shattered the last remnants of the quiet schoolteacher she once was, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The recoil slammed against her shoulder, a painful reminder that the choice to live would not be a gentle one. As dusk fell, they stood together, looking at their home, now a bristling, defiant shell. They were a team, united against the coming darkness, their partnership forged in silence and sealed with gunpowder. The darkness outside the cabin was absolute, a heavy blanket that swallowed the moonlight and muffled the sounds of the night. It was a silence that felt different, not empty, but waiting, a held breath before a scream. Alara could hear the frantic pounding of her own heart, a frantic drumbeat against the unnerving quiet, punctuated only by the crunch of a boot on gravel just outside the door. The attack did not begin with a roar, but with a sudden, sharp thud of a torch against the outer wall, its pitch-soaked rags making a sickening hiss, followed by the hungry crackle of fire catching on dry wood. The slow-burn tension of the past weeks finally ignited. Shouted curses tore through the night, and the first gunshot splintered the newly braced door. The explosion of wood and lead a violent punctuation mark announcing the arrival of the siege. Inside, the quiet sanctuary of the home became a death trap. Kai moved with a fluid, deadly grace, a phantom in the flickering firelight, his earlier stillness now unleashed into pure, economical motion. He pushed Alara towards the window slit, his voice a low, urgent command. Stay down. Don't think. Shoot when you see them. The air immediately filled with the deafening roar of gunfire and the acrid smell of sulfur and smoke. It was not a glorious battle. It was a brutal, chaotic struggle for survival inside a box of splintering wood. A bullet ripped through a stack of Alara's books, the treasured classics her father had given her, shredding years of poetry into meaningless confetti. Another stray shot shattered the simple ceramic water pitcher on the table, the last of their precious water splashing uselessly onto the floor before a third bullet struck the mantelpiece, obliterating a porcelain doll that had belonged to her mother, its smiling face exploding into 1,000 pieces. Every shot was a violation, a tearing of the fabric of the quiet life she had once known. Her hands trembled as she raised her father's rifle, its weight a terrible burden. Through the slit, she saw the contorted, hate-filled face of one of Blackwood's men, his mouth open in a silent yell, illuminated for a split second by a muzzle flash. The schoolteacher in her screamed, "No," but the survivor pulled the trigger. The recoil was a brutal slam against her shoulder, the sound of it stealing the air from her lungs and leaving a high-pitched ringing in her ears. She didn't see if he fell. She only saw more shadows swarming, their intent clear to burn them out like rats. The heat inside the cabin intensified, the smoke stinging her eyes and choking her breath until every gasp was a painful, rasping effort. The fight became a desperate, primal struggle against bullets, against fire, against the overwhelming force of Blackwood's greed. Kai moved between the windows, a silent, efficient dealer of death, his face a mask of grim determination. They were no longer a teacher and a scout. They were two souls backed into a corner, fighting for the right to exist against the crushing violence that had come to their door. The flames roared now, a living entity consuming the very air they needed to breathe, turning their fortress into a funeral pyre, the light of its destruction a horrifying beacon in the vast, indifferent darkness. The fight did not end in a clear victory but bled away with the suffocating darkness. Inside the collapsing, smoke-filled cabin, the ringing in their ears was a constant reminder of the chaos. Their ammunition was spent, their bodies were a canvas of bruises and exhaustion, and their will had been worn down to a single, stubborn ember of survival. They waited in the suffocating heat, listening to the roar of the flames that were consuming their world, expecting a final, overwhelming rush that never came. As the first pale, gray light began to bleed over the horizon, the attackers melted back into the shadows, their appetite for violence soured by the coming dawn and the undeniable truth that the two figures inside would not be easily broken. It was Kai's strategic fortifications that had held the physical line, turning the simple home into a deadly labyrinth of angles and death, but it was Ilara's newfound resolve, a force as unyielding as iron, that had held the spirit of their defense together. They stood in the smoldering ruins, listening to the dying crackle of the fire, when the sound of approaching horses reached them, not the frantic gallop of an attack, but the slow, weary tread of the law. The initial jolt of fear gave way to a hollow stillness. Sheriff Miller, with a single deputy at his side, rode into the clearing, his face a grim mask of exhaustion and profound regret, the shame of his inaction warring with the duty he was finally performing. His arrival was not a rescue, it was a reckoning. He found Silas Blackwood near the edge of the property, his fine coat stained with soot and torn at the sleeve, his face a portrait of disbelief and impotent fury. The sheriff's voice was devoid of triumph, heavy with the weight of a conscience that had finally won its own bitter battle. He didn't speak of attempted murder or the siege, but of disturbing the peace, of bringing a private war to the edge of his town, a chaos he could no longer ignore. Blackwood spat a curse, but the fight was gone from him, replaced by the cold fury of a man outmaneuvered. As the deputy bound his hands, the sun finally broke over the mountains, casting long, golden rays across a scene of utter devastation. The light illuminated everything with a terrible, unforgiving clarity. The shattered fences, the ground littered with dozens of spent cartridges that glinted like scattered teeth, the dark, still shapes of fallen men, and the blackened, skeletal remains of the home that had been their sanctuary. Ilara and Kai stepped out into the fractured dawn, the cool morning air a shock after the suffocating heat. They had survived. They were standing. But their home was a grave, and the quiet innocence they had briefly shared was a ghost, scarred forever by the brutality of the night. Their victory felt as hollow and fragile as the rising Sunday. The sun climbed higher, a silent, impartial witness to the devastation that lay before it. Standing amidst the skeletal remains of her home, Ilara felt a profound and aching exhaustion that went deeper than bone and muscle, settling into her very soul. Beside her, Kai stood not as a man she had saved, but as her equal, a partner in the brutal baptism of fire and smoke that had burned away everything they were before. His posture had changed. The defensive coil of the captive was gone, replaced by the steady, watchful stance of a guardian. The air smelled of wet ash and charred pine, a funereal incense for a life that was now gone. They didn't speak. There were no words that could encompass the violence of the night or the vast, uncertain quiet of the morning. Their shared glances spoke volumes, replaying the terror of the siege, the splintering wood, the roar of the flames, the faces twisted by hate, and the unspoken promise that they had not endured it alone. It was then that she saw the movement at the edge of the property. A figure, hesitant and small, darted out from the trees. It was one of the mothers from the town, a woman whose face had been twisted in scorn just days before. She placed a cloth-wrapped bundle on the edge of the porch, the only section that had not been consumed by flame, and retreated just as quickly, a silent and fleeting admission of guilt. Soon after, another figure came, this time Mr. Henderson from the store, who left a sack of flour and a side of bacon before disappearing. His shoulders stooped with a shame he could not voice. These were not offerings of friendship, but silent apologies, small gestures of humanity from a town that was now deeply and irrevocably divided. They were crumbs of comfort in the face of absolute loss, yet they were something tangible. The town of Red Rock could no longer pretend it did not have a conscience. Alara looked at the meager supplies, then at Kai, whose gaze was fixed on the distant, hazy line where the plains met the sky. They were no longer a schoolteacher and a rescued man, defined by the roles the world had assigned them. They were survivors, forged into something new in the crucible of the town's hatred. Their old identities burned away with the wood of the cabin. Everything she had owned was gone, her books, her home, the last mementos of her parents. Everything he had was his life, a thing that had been deemed worthless and was now his to command. They had nothing left but the scorched earth beneath their feet and the unshakable bond between them. Their future was a blank page, a terrifying and liberating emptiness. But as they stood together, turning away from the ashes of the past to face the endless horizon, the rising sun felt not like an ending, but an invitation. Their journey had just begun. For what is survival, if not the courage to take the first step away from the ruins?